as I was looking through the information on the webpage, I was looking at a really important report, the Caretakers of Our Indigenous Circle Calls to the Church report, and that was actually adopted at the General Council meeting that happened in Oshawa. Some words from Alberta Billy, a British Columbia Indigenous elder, and she said, we have our own way of doing things, and really I think that's the heart of this remit, is to live out apologies and commitments that we've made to the Indigenous Church around giving space for them to be church in a way that's true to them. For myself, I learned about that 20 years ago when I first started serving the United Church as a minister in Bella Bella, British Columbia, with the Heiltsuk First Nation. And we were a part of Prince Rupert Presbytery on the central coast of BC. And I would say about 75% of the congregations were Indigenous in that presbytery, and great geographical distance to get together. And so we met for a 3-day period. And I was amazed that the way of being the church in that place was not in sharing a written agenda, but by having some flip chart information and talking points, and then using a circle process and sharing what's happening in our communities, and then speaking from the heart about the issues before us on that flip chart. And I remember the chair at the time, Jim Angus, said, now, and just you guys watch, by the end of the day or the end of tomorrow, we will have covered, and kind of come to consensus on all of these decisions. So I think that's really the heart of what we're about here, is in giving the Indigenous Church space. It's a commitment to respectful relationship and Indigenous justice. And so I think I experienced that today, serving at Curve Lake with the monthly Ontario-Quebec Indigenous Ministries meetings, in the fellowship meetings that happen across various Indigenous communities in the summer months from May to October. So that's why I think it's important that this remit is before us and that we vote yes to it. So Caitlin, how about yourself?
In my opening, I shared that when Indigenous people shared their vision, my people did not want to hear. And a lot of my learning has been practicing that hearing side and listening to the stories and the truth. And that truth piece is so important. And so that's where I'm coming from. I'm coming from a place of ready to hear that truth, and in hopes that we can take steps towards reconciliation.
So Wanda's been part of our leadership team and had the great idea of inviting Teresa Burnett-Cole to join us. Teresa, I was remembering first meeting you at Greenbelt. Were you at Greenbelt? And then meeting you when you were serving at Christian Island. And of course, you're a part of those Ontario-Quebec Indigenous Ministries gatherings. But I do have that bio that you sent, and maybe I'll share that now, and then invite you to share with us about the importance of this remit. And Teresa actually put together a lot. She was part of the team that put together the resources around the remit. So, we're so grateful that you could spend some time with us tonight. But the Reverend Dr. Teresa Ann Burnett-Cole was called to the pulpit of Glebe St. James in Ottawa in 2014. And currently serves as the coordinating minister in the ministry team. Born in London, Teresa grew up living in southwestern Ontario. She studied music, Canadian history, and religious studies as an undergraduate at Western University before studying divinities at Emmanuel College. Teresa recently defended her doctoral thesis for her ThD in liturgical studies, also at Emmanuel. When she's not working on or writing about liturgy, Teresa is an accomplished visual artist and musician. With her strong commitment to social justice for all, Teresa works hard to support the passions and energy of Glebe St. James's congregation members and continues with her activist work supporting Indigenous and queer people. Married to Ruth for 27 years, they round out their family with their Jack Russell. Okwaho.
Akwaho, yeah.
Okwaho. So welcome, Teresa.
Thank you. And for those who don't know me, I position myself sort of between the Indigenous community and the settler community. My mom was an Irish Roman Catholic, is an Irish Roman Catholic. My dad is Indigenous, he's Mohawk, and United Church. And I sort of straddle those lines in a number of different ways. Well, when the group asked me about this, I kind of thought a little bit about how we would position this remit. And if you think of a staircase, the story of the Indigenous Church in the United Church of Canada is sort of 2 steps forward, 1 step back. You may not know that the Indigenous churches are amongst the oldest churches in the United Church of Canada. The first Indigenous mission, as it was called, was Grand River, and it began in 1825. So almost 100 years, right? Distant. Now, while church union is celebrated a great deal by us as a whole, I have to tell you, it wasn't really good news for Indigenous folks. They weren't asked, like every other congregation, whether they wanted to move into the United Church of Canada. They were just moved in, mostly by the Methodists and a few Presbyterians. No permission was sought. And that's also the same way the United Church got into the residential school business as well, right? Brought in along with everything else. There is a deafening silence about what happened to those Indigenous missions in the early days of the church. We know that they had their trusteeships dissolved. Can you imagine someone doing that in your congregation? Dissolved, and the property was then taken over by the National Church to be managed on behalf of the Indians. The colonialism in the United Church is rooted that deep. By 1948, some United Church leaders had actually cottoned on to the idea that the residential schools was not a good plan. And I'm proud to say that by 1948, the UCC was before the Parliament saying, we need to close these schools. This is not a good act. It would take, well, the UCC, the last UCC residential school closed in 1969. So it took us a while to accomplish that. The 1960s were really important to the Indigenous communities here in Canada. Well, actually in North America as a whole. You had Indigenous sovereignty movements like the American Indian movement, the National Indigenous Brotherhood, and in that same time, Indigenous people in the United Church of Canada started meeting. And for years, they met together to look at ways of being Indigenous and United Church. Interestingly enough, by 1977, there had been enough noise that the church conducted their first review of United Church work with Indigenous people because they found out it wasn't working. By 1980, they started consultations with the churches. This had already been, though, about 20 years of hard work on behalf of the Indigenous communities to get us to the point of actually having conversation. In the 1980s, BC Native Ministries sort of kicked things off and said, we need education, theological education for our people, and it needs to be done in our way. So they were the first ones to kick that off. By 84, Dr. Jesse Soto Center was founded. By 87, Francis Sandy would be formed. Then in the cost-reducing effort, those two schools were collapsed together and became the Sandy Soto Spiritual Center that we know today. 1986, That's an important date to hold on in your head. That was the first apology to the Indigenous Church. And it's kind of interesting because in an awful lot of Indigenous churches, you can go in and still find this hanging on the wall. Basically, they said they confessed to complicity in actively suppressing First Nations cultures as the majority culture church sought to share the gospel. And it's important for you to remember that while that was acknowledged, it was never accepted by our Indigenous colleagues. Alberta Billy, that Rodney mentioned a few minutes ago, was actually the first person who demanded an apology from the church. And she died this year, still waiting to see the fruition of that apology. And the work we're gathered here tonight about is part of enacting that apology. 1988, known in the church for other issues, was also a really important year for the Indigenous Church because All Native Circle Conference was founded. Again, something that had been sought for and worked on by Indigenous elders and leaders for years. We had our first Indigenous moderator. I like saying first now instead of only. The Right Reverend Stan McKay became the first Indigenous moderator, a feat not to be repeated until last year by Carmen Lansdowne. We established a healing fund in 1994 to try and put funds together in a way that could promote healing, because we realized things were seriously amiss in many communities. There was a lot of talk about it. We were supposed to raise $1 million. You may not know, but we never got there. Just tuck that away in your head. Tuck away all of the stuff that has happened between the Indigenous Church and the National Church and realize we could not raise $1 million for this. We raised $4 million for AIDS in Africa. Just saying. So the second apology came around in 1998, and that one was specifically to residential school survivors. They formed a residential school steering committee, a form of which still survives. We hired a national staff person to provide educational resources to the settler church. Catch the theme going on here? Yeah. A lot of what we do is for the settler church to understand. Now, we in 2008, so we're not talking very long ago, we created the Aboriginal Ministries Circle. That was the first time that Indigenous ministries had a working unit of their own to focus on their issues. We've done a lot of things, like change the crest in 2012. And those things are all good. We founded the National Indigenous Organization, again at the request of the Indigenous Church, because when the giant reorganization happened, that was really painful for a lot of Indigenous communities. They felt like in the loss of the All Native Circle Conference, they had lost their voice in the church. That was a pretty bitter pill to swallow, and there is still a lot of frustration, if not anger, out there. So when we formed the National Indigenous Organization, we set it up. We didn't even have a name for it. That's why it's called the National Indigenous Organization. And we formed a National Indigenous Council and a National Elders Council. That was as far as we could get in the organization. So what's the big deal about this remit? Well, I've given you that quick tour through history because I want you to know that this is not something new in the church. This is something very, very old. Just like the Indigenous churches weren't consulted about union, the first act, you need to know that that first act of the UCC was phenomenally colonial, right? Because it treated Indigenous folks like they were children, unable to make our own decisions. Not cool. Defending our rights as autonomous Indigenous nations has been a struggle in the church ever since. So we want a different kind of relationship, and that's what we're asking for. No more missions to Indians, but a partnership agreement. Part of the document that the General Council Commissioners saw was the National Indigenous Council's proposal, and we spoke of the two-row wampum. Quite frankly, I drafted that part of the document. It's my community's history, so I used an example that I knew. The idea of the wampum belt is specific to the Haudenosaunee, but its idea has been taken up. Now, if you've never heard of it, the Haudenosaunee wampum is what is behind me on the screen. And what it basically says is it's a covenant between two groups of people. And it says basically, we both need to go down the river in our own way, each in our own canoe. And we have to respect and let the other be who they are. We can work together, but we can't make decisions, and we can't paddle the other's canoe. What this remit does is try and establish that new relationship. The General Secretary, Michael Blair, realized that the church was being called to think outside the box on this one. And he realized that it was actually offensive to many Indigenous people to be required to ask permission to form themselves in a way that they deemed appropriate. At present, that's exactly what our church structure does. So the Indigenous church can do all the work it wants to create a new structure that, as Rodney talked about, is more circular and more based in conversation and dialogue than in rules, rules by Burnett. That's not how things function. Michael got this, what I think was an amazing brainwave, perhaps even inspiration, when he realized and said, perhaps what's needed is a preemptive remit. Now, that's an animal we've never used before in the United Church of Canada. Rather than asking the Indigenous Church to come hat in hand to the settler church for permission to continue their restructuring, the settler church could do what the Indigenous Church asked and clear away the blockages in the path so that they could continue in a decolonial way as they had hoped to. So put simply, it means we stop trying to fit a round peg, think circle, into the very square flow chart of church organization. Because right now it doesn't work.
Thank you so much, Teresa.